All right, history bucks, welcome back for part 2 of our modern Indian history deep dive. Today's episode is especially crucial for all you UPSC aspirants gearing up for the GS1 paper.
Oh, absolutely.
And of course, for anyone fascinated by this pivotal period in India's past, we're diving deep into the Surat Split of 1907,
Yeah.
a turning point within the Indian National Congress that sent shockwaves through the independence movement.
Big time.
And hey, if you're finding these deep dives useful in your prep, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. It really helps others discover the show.
Definitely.
Now let's set the stage. Before 1907, cracks were already appearing in the seemingly unified facade of the Indian National Congress, right?
Absolutely. The Congress, while united in its pursuit of greater autonomy for India, was becoming a house divided.
Okay.
You had the moderates,
Right.
who believed in gradual reform and working within the system. They were all about well-reasoned petitions and appeals to British fairness.
The slow and steady wins the race approach.
Exactly. But then you had the extremists, a rising force led by firebrands like Bal Gangadhar Tilak.
Right.
These guys were impatient for change.
Yeah.
Wanted complete independent Swaraj, and they weren't afraid to push the boundaries with methods like boycotts and strikes.
So you have these two contrasting approaches brewing within the Congress.
Yeah.
What were the specific triggers that finally led to the explosion at Surat?
Well, imagine the 1907 session as a pressure cooker reaching its boiling point. 4 key resolutions were put forward.
Okay.
Dealing with issues like the Swadeshi movement, boycotting foreign goods, national education, and self-rule.
Right.
These resolutions became battlegrounds for the moderates and extremists.
Okay, let's unpack these resolutions a bit. What were the core disagreements?
The extremists, fueled by figures like Tilak, wanted to take these movements national. They saw the Swadeshi movement, for instance,
Right.
as a chance to galvanize the entire nation against British economic dominance. But the moderates preferred a more contained approach, fearing the potential for unrest and chaos if things escalated too quickly.
So it wasn't just about the what, but also the how and the how far.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this difference in strategy was deeply rooted in their contrasting ideologies.
Okay.
The moderates still believed in appealing to British goodwill working within the system for incremental change, but the extremists, they were done playing by the rules.
Right.
They saw the British Raj as an inherently oppressive force that needed to be overthrown, not appeased.
You mentioned Tilak being a key figure in the extremist camp.
Yeah.
What was it about his personality and leadership that made him such a lightning rod?
Tilak was a powerful orator, a charismatic leader who connected with the masses.
Yeah.
He had this unwavering belief in India's inherent right to self-rule,
Right.
and wasn't afraid to articulate that vision, even if it meant challenging the British head-on.
Mm-hmm.
His fiery speeches and uncompromising stance resonated with the younger generation, who were growing increasingly impatient with the moderates' cautious approach.
It's fascinating to see how global events were also shaping the nationalist movement back in India. What was happening on the world stage that was influencing these ideological currents?
Think about what was happening in the world at this time.
Yeah.
Japan defeating Russia in 1905.
Ah.
This had a huge impact on figures like Tilak and the extremists. Here was an Asian power taking on a European giant and winning.
Right.
It shattered the myth of European invincibility and fueled the belief that India, too, could throw off the shackles of colonial rule.
It's almost like a domino effect. Events happening thousands of miles away were sending ripples through the very fabric of the Indian nationalist movement.
Absolutely.
Wow.
The extremists saw these victories as proof that even the mightiest empires could be challenged and defeated.
Yeah.
It emboldened them to push for a more assertive, even radical approach to achieving independence.
Okay.
So you have this already volatile mix of ideological differences and strategic disagreements.
Yeah.
And then to make matters worse, a leadership struggle erupts at the 1907 session.
Oh boy, adding fuel to the fire.
Right.
Tell us more about this leadership clash.
Oh.
What were the fault lines and who were the key players vying for control?
The extremists were backing either Tilak or Lala Lajpat Rai to lead the session, figures known for their assertive stance. The moderates, on the other hand, threw their weight behind Rash Bahari Ghose,
Right.
a more moderate figure. Even the venue for the session became a point of contention.
Wow.
It was initially planned for Nagpur, where Tilak had a strong base of support.
Okay.
But the moderates, sensing trouble, successfully maneuvered to shift it to Swaraj.
You could almost feel the tension building, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's like waiting for a powder keg to explode.
Definitely.
Take us inside that fateful session in Surat.
Yeah.
What actually transpired that day that led to the infamous split?
Picture this. The session is in full swing. Emotions are running high.
Yeah.
Tilak rises to address the gathering,
Okay.
ready to make his case for a more radical agenda. But the moderates, fearing his influence and his potential to sway the delegates, try to block him from speaking.
That must have gone down like a lead balloon with the extremist camp, denying their leader a platform.
Oh, yeah.
It's practically an invitation for chaos.
And chaos is exactly what ensued.
Right.
The denial of Tilak's right to speak was seen as a direct attack on the extremist faction, a silencing of their voice.
Of course.
The situation escalated rapidly, arguments, shouting matches.
Oh my goodness.
And then, well, let's just say things got physical.
Wait, physical, like fisticuffs. From reasoned debate to actual brawls.
That's right. Chairs were flying, tempers were flaring. The Congress session, once a symbol of unity, had descended into utter pandemonium.
Wow.
It was a dramatic and chaotic end to what was supposed to be a gathering of India's leading minds to chart a course for the nation's future.
So what happened in the immediate aftermath of this showdown? Did anyone try to salvage the situation? Did the session just abruptly end?
It did. The session was adjourned indefinitely, leaving the Congress fractured and the future of the independence movement hanging in the balance. It was a pivotal moment that would have far-reaching consequences for India's struggle for freedom. But we'll delve into those consequences and the long-term impacts of the Surat Split in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. The Surat Split wasn't just a dramatic spectacle. It was a turning point that cast a long shadow over the Indian independence movement.
Okay, so let's unpack the fallout. What happened after that chaotic session in Surat? Did the Congress just dissolve into two separate entities?
Essentially, yes. The split formally divided the Congress into two camps, the extremists and the moderates.
Right.
Each with their own vision for India's future and how to achieve it.
I'm guessing any attempts to bridge that divide and row the two factions back together didn't exactly go smoothly?
There were efforts at reconciliation, some quite sincere. Even Rabindranath Tagore, a figure we often associate with art and literature, tried to mediate between the two sides.
Tagore trying to play peacemaker between the fiery extremists and more measured moderates. That's intriguing.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about how deeply this split resonated within Indian society?
It shows that this wasn't just some political squabble confined to the halls of the Congress. It was a reflection of a much deeper ideological divide that was running through the heart of Indian society. Tagore, with his profound understanding of human nature and his commitment to unity, recognized the danger of this growing chasm.
But even Tagore's efforts weren't enough to bridge the gap.
Unfortunately, no. The ideological differences between the moderates and the extremists ran too deep.
Right.
The moderates were still committed to working within the system, advocating for gradual reforms and appealing to British fairness.
Yeah.
The extremists, however, had lost faith in the British Raj's willingness to grant India true autonomy.
Okay.
They believed that complete independent Swaraj could only be achieved through more assertive, even confrontational means.
So the split continued to widen, each faction becoming more entrenched in its own approach.
Yeah.
What impact did this have on the Congress as an organization and on the broader independence movement?
In the short term, it undoubtedly weakened the nationalist movement. A united Congress would have presented a much stronger challenge to British rule.
Okay.
With the Congress fractured, the British saw an opportunity to exploit those divisions to implement their age-old tactic of divide and rule.
Ah, the classic divide and conquer strategy. Turn your opponents against each other, and you don't have to fight as hard yourself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The British were masters of this tactic.
Yeah.
And the Surat Split played right into their hands.
Wow.
They could now focus on suppressing the extremists who posed a more direct threat while simultaneously trying to co-opt the moderates with promises of limited reforms.
So while the moderates continued to push for reforms within the system, the extremists were forced to find alternative avenues to pursue their goals.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The Surat Split, coupled with the moderates' perceived inability to deliver significant concessions from the British, created a space for the rise of revolutionary movements.
So we're talking about groups advocating for armed rebellion, underground movement, perhaps even acts of sabotage against British institutions.
Yeah. Yes. Groups like the Anushalan Samiti and the Gadar Party emerged, attracting young, idealistic individuals who were willing to take extreme risks to free their nation. They saw armed struggle as the only effective way to challenge the might of the British Empire.
Okay.
The split had unleashed a new wave of activism, one that was far more confrontational and willing to push the boundaries of resistance.
We've talked about how the British exploited the split, using it to further their divide and rule strategy.
Right.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how they did that? What specific actions did they take to capitalize on this division? within the Congress.
One of the most significant examples is the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims in 1909.
Okay.
Ostensibly, this move was presented as a way to ensure political representation for Muslims.
Right.
But in reality, it was a calculated move to further divide the Indian population along religious lines.
So a classic case of divide and conquer in action.
Exactly. By creating separate electorates, the British hoped to sow discord between Hindus and Muslims, thereby weakening the Congress's vision of a united nationalist movement.
Okay.
It was a cynical but effective tactic to undermine the push for independence. And it wasn't just about stoking religious divisions.
Right.
They also clamped down on the extremist faction, arresting key leaders like Tilak and suppressing their activities.
It sounds like the British were playing a shrewd game, using the Surat Split as a wedge to weaken the nationalist movement from multiple angles.
Oh, for sure.
But what about the moderates? Did they manage to achieve any meaningful progress through their approach of constitutional politics and dialogue with the British?
They did manage to secure some concessions.
Okay.
The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, introduced in the wake of the Surat Split,
Right.
did offer some limited reforms.
Okay.
However, they fell far short of the moderates' expectations and did little to address the fundamental issue of British control over India's destiny.
So a case of too little too late.
In many ways, yes. The reforms were seen as a token gesture, an attempt to appease the moderates without actually granting any real power or autonomy.
Right.
For many, particularly the younger generation, it confirmed their belief that the moderates' approach was simply not effective in challenging the entrenched British Raj.
So we have the moderates striving for reforms within the system, achieving limited success.
Right.
And we have the extremists forced outside the Congress, witnessing the rise of more radical and revolutionary movements.
Yeah.
But for our listeners who are trying to really grasp the core differences between these two factions,
Sure.
could you give us a sort of side-by-side comparison of their key features?
Of course. Let's imagine a table. On one side, we have the moderates. Their base of support was primarily the educated elite professionals, wealthy landowners, those who benefited at least to some extent from the existing system.
Right.
Their ideology was rooted in Western liberal thought, emphasizing gradual reform constitutional methods and appealing to British fairness. They believed that India could achieve self-rule gradually through dialogue and cooperation with the British.
So they were the evolution, not revolution crowd.
Exactly. They were also cautious about mass participation in politics, fearing that it could lead to instability and unrest.
Right.
Now, on the other side of our table, we have the extremists.
Right.
They drew their support from a much broader base, including students, urban intellectuals, and sections of the peasantry, those who felt the brunt of British rule most acutely.
So a more grassroots populist movement compared to the moderates' elitist base.
Yes, and their ideology was quite different too.
Right.
They were inspired by India's own history and cultural heritage,
Right.
emphasizing the need to revive India's past glory and assert its unique identity.
Okay.
They rejected the notion of British superiority and believed in the inherent right of Indians to rule themselves.
So a much more India-first perspective, a rejection of the idea that India needed British guidance to modernize.
Absolutely. And unlike the moderates, they were far more willing to embrace mass mobilization and extra constitutional methods like boycotts and passive resistance to achieve their goals.
Right.
They saw the masses as a crucial force for change, not a potential source of instability.
So while both groups ultimately aimed for self-rule, their paths and ideologies were starkly different.
Indeed, the moderates believed in playing by the rules, appealing to British reason and goodwill.
Yeah.
The extremists, on the other hand, were ready to challenge those rules, to push the boundaries, and to mobilize the masses to achieve their goals. This fundamental difference was at the heart of the Surat Split and had a profound impact on the trajectory of the Indian independence movement.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the simmering tensions within the Congress to the dramatic showdown at Surat and the far-reaching consequences that followed. But let's zoom out now and tackle the big question that's probably on everyone's mind, especially our UPSC aspirants.
Right.
Did the Surat Split ultimately help or hinder India's fight for independence?
That's a question that historians have been grappling with for over a century. On the surface, it's easy to view the split as a major setback,
Right.
a moment of weakness that allowed the British to tighten their grip on India. And to some extent, that's a valid point. The split did weaken the nationalist movement in the short term.
But as we've seen throughout history, sometimes even setbacks can have unexpected consequences. Could it be that the Surat Split, while initially divisive, actually forced the movement to evolve and adapt in ways that ultimately strengthened it?
That's a very insightful way to look at it. The split, while painful,
Right.
forced both the moderates and the extremists to reassess their strategies.
Yeah.
The moderates, faced with the limitations of their approach,
Okay.
realized that they needed to adopt a more assertive stance to truly challenge British rule.
So even the moderates, the proponents of gradual reform, had to acknowledge that playing by the rules wasn't enough to achieve real change.
Precisely. They began to understand that the British weren't going to hand over power willingly.
Right.
And on the other side, the extremists, pushed to the fringes of the Congress,
Yeah.
had to find new and innovative ways to mobilize the masses and keep the flame of resistance burning.
So each faction, in its own way, was forced to adapt and evolve as a result of the split.
Exactly. And let's not forget that the split wasn't permanent.
Okay.
The two factions eventually reunited in 1916,
Right.
recognizing that a united front was essential to achieving independence.
So the Surat Split, rather than being the death knell of the movement, was more like a catalyst for growth and transformation, a sort of 2 steps back, 3 steps forward kind of situation.
I think that's a very apt analogy. The split, while undoubtedly a period of turmoil and uncertainty, ultimately forced the Indian nationalist movement to mature,
Okay.
to diversify its strategies, and to build a more resilient and inclusive movement that could truly represent the aspirations of all Indians.
And those lessons learned during the years of separation, the need for unity, the importance of mobilizing the masses, the willingness to challenge British power more directly, these were all crucial factors in the eventual success of the Indian independence movement.
Absolutely. The Surat Split, while a dramatic and divisive event, ultimately helped to forge a stronger, more sophisticated, and more determined nationalist movement that could effectively challenge the might of the British Empire.
It's a great reminder that history is rarely a neat and tidy progression of events.
Right.
It's full of twists and turns, setbacks and breakthroughs, and sometimes those seemingly negative events can act as catalysts for unexpected progress.
Indeed, and that's what makes the study of history so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing dates and names, but about understanding the complexities of human action,
Right.
the interplay of different forces, and the unexpected consequences of events that shape the course of nations.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the Surat Split. We've explored the causes, the key players, the dramatic events of the session itself, and the long-term consequences. I hope you found it as enlightening as I did, and for all our listeners out there, especially our dedicated UPSC aspirants, keep those history books open and those minds engaged. Remember, every event, even seemingly divisive one, like the Surat Split, has valuable lessons to teach us about the long and complex journey towards India's independence. Until next time, happy learning,